Alright folks, so here we're back with Chapter 6. Upon closer examination, I think it will actually be really beneficial for us to split Chapter 6 into two separate sections. So in the first section, we're going to talk about types of fonts. We're also going to discuss topics like web fonts, how to find them, how to use them. The second half of Chapter 6, we're going to get into defining text characteristics, colors, italics, bold, items like that. My guess is that we're probably not looking at a full half hour between the two of them, but I could be wrong. So let's get started with talking about what a font is. With any luck, in 115 and or Web 140, you've had the opportunity to sort of discuss this. The term font is often used to describe a typeface. And people kind of use the term interchangeably with typeface. So Times New Roman is considered to be a font, and Georgia is considered to be a font. The reality is that those items are typefaces. A font is actually a word that defines not just the typeface, but other characteristics of that typeface, such as its size, whether or not it is bold or italics, and sometimes the color as well. So all of those bits of information go into defining what a font is. You'll see closer to the end of the second lecture or the second video about typefaces why that's an important distinction. But for the time being, just understand that I'm going to use the word typeface. The book uses font pretty much throughout this entire section, but I'm going to use typeface, and that's why. So let's talk a little bit about different types of typefaces. There are typefaces that are what are called serif typefaces. If you look in your Chapter 6 demo files and look at the HTML file, you will notice that you've got a typeface here, and let me sort of zoom in a little bit so you can look at it a little bit more closely. You can see how this typeface has little notches, little tails on some of the characters. Those little tails are called serifs, and as a result, typefaces like this and Times New Roman and the like are considered to be serif typefaces. And if we go back to our page, we can get a slightly better look when we look here in Firefox, and we can see the little tails here on the T and on the H and on the M. This is a serif typeface. Serif typefaces have traditionally, throughout the years, been used specifically for print and only for headings on web pages. Now, the reason for this was because when you are dealing with print, the serifs actually give you a little bit of extra white space around each character, which makes it easier to read on a page. However, due to the poor quality of most screens until the last 5 years or so, they actually would muddy the display. They would make it harder to differentiate characters from one another. The truth is that most screens are of such high quality and can have such a high resolution that that has ceased to be an issue. And it's not at all unusual to go to websites where the entire website has its content in a serif typeface. But ultimately, a lot of that is going to depend upon your client, what their needs are, what their brand identity looks like, what their other documents look like. It will also depend on whether or not you can find a serif font that meets their needs. Now, way back in the olden days of the wood-burning internet, you had about, 9 typefaces from which to choose that were considered to be web-safe, air quotes included. And basically, those typefaces were typefaces that you could find on pretty much any computer. I mean, there were exceptions. If somebody was running one of those text-based browsers like Lynx or something, all bets were off. But most of your people who were running Mozilla browsers or Internet Explorer, any of those, they could generally view Times or Times New Roman, Arial, Georgia, Verdana, Comic Sans, Papyrus, I think, might have been one of them, God help us all, and there were probably one or two others. I honestly don't remember what they are at this point. You can Google web-safe fonts and find out more information. there were lots of moves in terms of trying to determine how best to allow people to use other typefaces. After all, brand identities are in all sorts of typefaces, and it's just far more visually appealing if you can set your website apart by having a typeface that maybe isn't on every single solitary website you visit. So there were lots of ways people dreamt up. They thought of, okay, well, if I want a heading, I can just create an image file, and I can use that typeface, and I can use any typeface I want. The problem, of course, being every time you wanted to change that heading, you had to go back into your graphic design program and create a new heading. Made it really difficult for your clients to maintain their own websites, and it was kind of a pain in the neck for you as a designer to have to open up Photoshop to change a single word or to correct a misspelling. So we then moved on to some other techniques, and one technique that was discovered is something called Cipher, and you might occasionally find references to Cipher in some of the assignments and such. Cipher was something we touched upon using several semesters ago, and I haven't managed to eradicate all signs of it from all of our documentation. Basically, Cipher is a Flash-based text replacement technique, and we'll talk about it a little bit more in a couple of weeks. But ultimately, what it meant was you would go into Cipher, which was a program, you would use the typeface you wanted that was on your computer, and it would create a Flash, as in Adobe Flash, sort of item that you could insert in your web pages, and it would have the typeface in question. Now clearly that is no longer a viable option, as Flash is not supported on all devices, especially when you start talking about mobile devices. And since the vast majority of people are starting to view the web on their mobile devices, and in fact there are many predictions that they should overtake desktop devices sometime in the next couple of years, there's no point looking at a technology that relies on a technology that is really kind of on its way out. So we're not going to look at Cipher. The other format that we look at is what's called web fonts. Now, what web fonts are their typefaces that have licenses that allow them to be used on the internet. And you can, using one of two different methods, include a web font in your page. So what we're going to do is we're going to do two different web fonts. And we might, in fact, need to go to 3 different videos here. We'll see what happens. But basically, we're going to do 2 different types of web font inclusion on this sample document, and then we're going to come back and take a look at some of the other font characteristics we can change and see why it's so important to make that distinction between fonts and typefaces. So I'm going to actually end this right here, and I'm going to start a new video that will allow us to sort of dive headlong into talking about web fonts. So this is what I'm going to need you to do in the meantime. Make certain you have downloaded the Chapter 6 demo files and unzip them. We're going to be working with the text HTML and text CSS files. Make certain that you have an internet connection wherever you are, so this isn't something that if you're watching it passively, cool, watch it on whatever device you want, but if your intent is to follow along, you are probably going to need to make certain you have some sort of internet capability as well, because the internet capability is going to allow you to use those web fonts. That is one thing about web fonts. Clearly the person who's visiting your website needs to have a connection to the internet, but then in theory they wouldn't have a connection to the internet if they couldn't see your page, then they wouldn't have a connection to the internet. So there you go. All right, I'll be back in just a minute. Thanks.